as well as outside of the Waldorf community. We obviously have a lot of experts in our own community that specialize in issues that pertain to children and adolescents, as well as pertaining to families, nutrition, etc. So hopefully this is the beginning of kind of an expansion of the idea of assessing, treating, preserving the whole child. A little bit about myself. I'm Joshua Magleby. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist in private practice in Fairlawn. I have 2 kids here at Spring Garden, a 5th grader and one in the nursery, and we've been here for about 5 years now. My background, I grew up in the West. I started graduate school. Before I started graduate school, I was really interested in working with kids. I was going to be a kindergarten teacher. And then spent some time in the schools and realized I didn't want to do that, and took a class in child psychopathology and fell in love with it. So I knew I wanted to work with kids who had issues and families that had issues. And then I started my graduate career in Memphis, Tennessee, and one of the things I did was I worked at a children's hospital for a pediatric neuropsychologist, and I realized that's another thing I want to do is I love the brain. I'm kind of a brain geek. So you combine the two, so I love kids and I love the brain. And so neuropsychology kind of became my path. It's kind of taken me all over the place. I was in Memphis, we went back to Utah, which is where I grew up, and then I did a school-based internship for a year when I was in one of the local Utah schools. Then I did a clinical internship at Kennedy Krieger Institute, which is through Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. It's a pediatric rehab hospital. So I did my time there in neuropsychology and child and family therapy. Then I spent a year in a large private practice in just outside of Washington, D.C. We did a lot of work with a lot of the private school work, a lot of evaluations, a lot of counseling, etc. And then I came out here to the Cleveland Clinic and did my a 2-year fellowship in neuropsychology, both adult and pediatrics. I specialize in pediatric neuropsychology and in child psychology in general. And my training experiences have been varied. I've been in hospitals, I've been in community mental health, I've been in, special schools. And what I found, and this is why I started with this topic, is that more often than not, every child I've ever seen, meaning maybe 95%, they have a sleep problem of some kind or another. Usually it's that they're not getting enough sleep. That's of course to varying degrees. But another thing that astounded me was that nothing was being done about it. It wasn't even being identified as a problem. And so hopefully today I'm going to, I'll open your eyes to not only the problems that are associated with sleep, but also what can you do? What are the solutions? And these are the sources of information that I use for this talk. So National Sleep Foundation was kind of runs or heads up the national advocacy group for sleep. These are all different journals that I use. American Psychological Association, they have a wealth of information on their website, it's apa.org. Some books, I use the OSNA Research Bulletin. These 2 books here, I'm kind of going to point out, especially because they're very interesting and they're very good at what they do. The 7 o'clock bedtime, written by Shane, and we actually, at home, we used this book when our older son was about 4 years old. We never could figure out, it was hard to get him to sleep at 8 and on and on. And I'll tell more personal stories about our own family, as we go along. But what she talks about is that you can get your child to bed at 7. Imagine if your child goes to bed at 7 and they wake up at 6. They wake up without an alarm. They wake up without you having to shake them. That's when you know your child is getting enough sleep. The bottom line, if you don't have to wake them up, more than likely they're getting enough sleep. Nurture Shock, fantastic book. There's a section on sleep, there's a section on all sorts of things pertaining to children. So I recommend that one as well. So here's our agenda for tonight. We'll see if we stay on tack. I tend to move off. I tend to go off on tangents. I'll try and stay, on menu, so to speak. I'll start off with a true story that kind of illustrates the issue of sleep, lack of sleep, and how that is misperceived in the world these days, or at least in our country. If we're going to talk about sleep, and we're going to talk about the problems and the solutions associated with sleep, we obviously have to define it. Why do we sleep? We sleep for reasons. Most people don't really understand why do we sleep. We just know we sleep. Physiology and psychology of sleep, sort of the processes that are involved in sleep. This section here does get to be a little dense. I'll try not to stick on it too much, but I think it's important for parents to know some of the science about why we sleep. Then we'll get into kind of looking at children versus adolescents because they're different. Especially if you have a teenager, you know that they are a different beast for so many reasons. But one of them is sleep. And it's the research that's being done, especially recently, excuse me, is fascinating on teenage sleep. Then we'll get into the sleep problems. What are some of the causes? What are some of the disorders that are sort of where sleep is not considered, but where it should be? And we'll get into both the effect of that the sleep problems have on school achievement and then on social ability. And of course, those go hand in hand. And then finally, we'll talk about sleep solutions, okay? And I encourage you, this is a lecture, so to speak, but I encourage you to participate. If you have a question, if you have a story, as long as it's a short one, about a sleep issue that you've dealt with in your family, by all means bring it up. I've taught I said in that little spiel that went out to everybody, I've taught at both the undergraduate and graduate levels, and I found that it was when students kind of brought up their own experience and interacted in that way, that's oftentimes where the greatest learning would occur. So by all means, this is not just a lecture, okay? All right, objectives. In my field, one of the things we have to do is we have to do continuing education. And there was a question if individuals could use this as a way of getting continuing education. And so to do that, I need to have objectives. Okay? These are some of the objectives. I want you to be able to identify the reasons why kids need sleep. It's not just because, well, they fall asleep or because they're cranky afterwards. There's scientific, demonstrable reasons why they need sleep. Understand the physiological and psychological processes of sleep. Name at least 3 types of sleep problems. And finally, solutions from at least 2 main areas, one of them being behavior. There are lots of different areas, behavioral being one. Now, let me tell you the true story. The first job I had out of my fellowship was at a community mental health center in downtown Cleveland. And the majority of kids that I saw were low income, came from low income families, very impoverished. And a lot of these children were being referred for ADHD, bipolar disorder. And occasionally we'd see kids who were referred for psychosis. We wouldn't often see that in a community mental health setting. Oftentimes they'd go to the hospital. Well, one day I had a 13-year-old girl who I was seeing. And the referral was for hallucinations. She was hearing things, hearing voices, telling her she was no good, seeing things, seeing little green men. That's the way she described it. Okay. So she comes into my office. She seems like a kind of a normal 13-year-old girl. Seems a little on the tired side, a little quiet, a little reserved. But she wasn't grabbing at things and she wasn't mumbling to herself. There was no outwardly psychotic behavior. So I'm talking with her. Her parent was in the room initially, and then it was time to start testing. But what I always would do is I'd interview the child before. I was asking her about a few things in her life, and one of the things I asked about was sleep. And what I came to find out was that she was not getting very much sleep. In fact, she was getting 2 to 3 hours of sleep a night. This was long-standing, and I asked her, well, why? Well, how come you can't sleep? She said, I'm afraid to sleep. So when I close my eyes, I have nightmares. So what she would do is she would stay up until she passed out. She was doing this on a consistent basis. Every now and then her body would force her to sleep a little bit earlier and she'd sort of catch up from that sleep debt that she had incurred. But she was having hallucinations. Now, is that a disorder? Is she psychotic? Is it schizophrenia? Is it some type of scary disorder that's very rare, if not in children, if it's controversial even to think that kids have schizophrenia? Or is she just sleep deprived? Well, she was referred by a psychiatrist who had put her on atypical antipsychotic medication. She was on 2 of them. Now, those are pretty powerful medications. Okay, I'm not here to bash anybody. Psychiatrists, educators, other psychologists, nothing. I'm just presenting the facts. But it was concerning to me, very concerning, that here was somebody who really was suffering from chronic sleep deprivation, but she was being thought of as psychotic. So my question to you is, what is your child like when they don't sleep? Crabby. Okay?
Psychotic.
Psychotic. There we go. What else?
Difficult.
Difficult. What do you mean by difficult?
Just irrational.
Irrational.
Uncooperative.
I
Okay.
have a student who tells me when he hasn't slept the night before, he walks in and says, "You hate me, all the teachers hate me."
Okay. So automatically.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Weepy, emotional.
Okay. Weepy and emotional. Very good. Anything else? In terms of their ability to learn, pay attention. Do they pay attention very well? Can't concentrate, right? Are they fidgety?
Everything's catastrophic.
Everything's catastrophic. Yes. Now, everything you're telling me goes along with, when you're not getting enough sleep, and we're probably talking about one night, right? The next night, so they have a poor night. The next morning, they're like this. We're not talking about kids who have been, who are a week or a month where they've had this chronic sleep deprivation, right? Okay. Well, is it sleep deprivation that you just described, or is it one of these? ADHD. 1990s, everybody had ADHD. Even today, mostly everybody has ADHD. All kids who I see, I do disability evaluations among other things in my practice. So I see a number of kids come through there who are filing for disability benefits. It's this. It's always ADHD or bipolar disorder. It's now bipolar disorder. This decade, this is the decade, or at least starting in 2000, is the decade of bipolar disorder. Okay? Not only do all adults have bipolar disorder, but all kids do too. ODD is oppositional defiant disorder. Oppositional, defiant, irrational.
12-year-old.
12-year-old.
It's the new alphabet.
Yes. Arguing, angry, vindictive, non-compliant, that sort of thing. Social relating problems, or PDD, pervasive developmental disorders, which includes autism and Asperger's disorder. Okay? Is it depression? Is it anxiety? The reason why I'm listing these is because this is what kids get diagnosed with. Kids don't get diagnosed with this. There is in what's known as the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is what psychologists like myself, psychiatrists, pediatricians, we use to diagnose mental illness, mental disorders. There is a diagnosis. There are sleep disorders in there. I have never once seen a sleep disorder diagnosed. Not once. Now, I haven't, I'm 39, I haven't been in this practice, for 40 years. But my partner, the senior partner in my practice, has been. He can count on his one hand how many times he's seen a sleep disorder diagnosed. It's always these things, the catastrophic ones, the schizophrenia, the psychosis. Go for the simplest explanation. And this one isn't the one unfortunately, it's not the one that's often gone for. So what's the importance of sleep? Sufficient sleep is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And should be thought of as a vital sign of good health. This is Dr. Giles, the National Center for Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. Okay? Recent studies have suggested that the downtime of the brain, remember the brain is really active during the day. The downtime of the brain, that's important. That's the first part of sleep. The first few hours of sleep, for the most part, that's the downtime for the brain. Because otherwise it's pretty active during dream sleep, which we'll get into. This is where it repairs cellular damage caused by all the metabolic processes that go into thinking and learning and living. You may also, that's the time to grow new brain cells, neurogenesis, grow connections between the nerve cells, called synaptogenesis. That's when this happens, is during sleep. Well, it gets interfered with if you're not sleeping. Sleep is more than just resting for the day. It is a matrix of all learning and teaching. That came from Osna, and I thought, what a great statement. The matrix, as it's the beginning. It's how it starts. You get enough sleep, you got a good start. You don't have a good start. And I love this statement here. If sleeping and dreaming do not perform vital biological functions, then they must represent nature's most stupid blunder and most colossal waste of time. Everything sleeps. Theoretically, everything. All mammals do. All birds do. Why do we do it? It's been such a mystery for so long, and it still continues to be somewhat of a mystery as to why we sleep. We know the effects of sleep, and more importantly, when we don't get enough sleep. Now, in children and adolescents, sleep is the primary activity of the brain during early development. That tails off a little bit as they get older, but That's where the learning comes in. You can be exposed to stimuli when you're awake, but it's not going to become a memory until you sleep on it. That old adage, sleep on it. You'll know in the morning. There's something to that. By the age of 2, most children have spent more time awake than asleep, or more time asleep than awake. And they'll eventually have spent 40% of their time on this earth sleeping, until they become adults. It's especially important because it directly impacts. That's important. It's not indirect. I'm not saying, there's kind of a small correlation. It directly impacts mental and physical development. Kids sleep differently than adults. They spend a lot of their time in this restorative period of time, and I'll get to that later on in the lecture. It's where the learning takes place. They get more time in learning than we do because they need it. That's what they're for. Sleep deprivation has been linked to these, what was assumed to be unrelated phenomena: lower IQ or lower intelligence scores, obesity, ADHD, and then some of the other ones that I showed you. But the research, it's still not being studied very well. The Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Dean Beebe, who's a neuropsychologist there, has been doing a lot of the seminal work on at least sleep apnea in children, and also looking now at more normally or typically functioning kids and sleep problems. But that's about it. It's surprising. In adolescence, it's a fascinating study done by Kyla Wallstrom out of the University of Minnesota. She found that Minnesota high schoolers with A averages averaged 15 minutes of sleep more than their C-level peers. Doesn't sound like a lot. Maybe it was just happenstance. Maybe it just was that one study. Except it was an identical result was found in Providence, Rhode Island. Okay, that was done by Brown University. We're not talking about a lot. Can you tell, though, when your kids haven't had enough sleep? We're not talking about when they stayed up until midnight. Sometimes it's just they normally go to bed at 9, they went to bed at 10, or they fell asleep at 10. It's an hour. Or maybe it was just half an hour. And now, Mary Karskadon, she's sort of world-renowned when it comes to adolescent sleep problems. What she's done in her research, what she's found is that teens who get the sleep they need, they're less likely to be depressed. They go to school. They go to school on time, which is important. They have better grades. They don't crash their cars as often. And they don't have these nutritional or metabolic problems that end up turning into obesity, which is an epidemic in this country, right? For a variety of reasons, certainly. But one of them is chronic lack of sleep. All right, you got to define sleep. Like I said, the mechanism behind sleep, the purpose of sleep, still is not all that well understood. Sleep itself is this: a naturally reoccurring state of relatively suspended sensory and motor activity, characterized by total or partial unconsciousness and the inactivity of nearly all voluntary muscles. I won't say that again, okay? But just, so now you know what sleep is. I mean, you already know what sleep is anyway. What goes on during sleep is that this is when repair work happens. All the stress, all the wear and tear that goes on during daily activities is repaired during sleep. Particularly at the beginning, like I said. Sleep is important, the entire sleep period is important. The first part of sleep, where you're dreaming less and you're repairing more, is really important. It's the first stage that your body goes to when it's been deprived of sleep. Again, sleep is observed in just about every living thing in the animal kingdom on this planet. In humans, and in some other animals, rats included, they've done a lot of studies on rats, if you don't get enough sleep, you have to have it for survival. If you don't, you can die. Can people die from having a lack of sleep? There was an article that just came out, was online, about a gentleman in China who was awake for 3 days playing online video games, and he died. And this is not the first study. Now, are there other complications? More than likely. He probably wasn't eating, he may not have been drinking, those sorts of things. But he was not sleeping. Can you imagine 72 hours without any sleep? Why do we sleep? We reduce any of the damage that's caused by the use of oxygen. Okay, we use oxygen daily, but it leaves byproducts. It leaves these free radicals. Sleep, most of this is based on rat studies, shows that those are taken up by the body and dealt with so that they don't cause damage. If you're sleep deprived, though, that mechanism doesn't work very well. Neurogenesis, I mentioned that before. Neurogenesis and synaptogenesis, so formation of new brain cells or new connections between the brain cells. Sort of like the telephones or the telephone wires, okay, how they talk to each other. That happens when you're sleeping. And if you don't sleep, that is affected. And this one down here is really important. We'll get into this a little bit later on tonight. Memory processing and the consolidation of memories. Learning is simply, it's taking an experience and turning it into something that you can replicate. Right? That's all it is. It's a process called consolidation. And we'll talk a little bit more into that later on. Two types of sleep, two main types. There's non-REM, so non-rapid eye movement sleep, and then there's REM sleep. Most of you have heard of REM sleep, right? It's been out in the media for a long time. Non-REM is characterized by deep sleep, very deep. Generally no dreaming in that. Anytime, if you've ever had your child have a night terror, where they've sat up in bed and they scream it's the scariest thing as a parent, isn't it? I mean, it's like they're being murdered. It's horrible. It's a night terror. They don't know where they are, right? They're confused. It's same thing with sleepwalking, sleep talking. They don't know where they are. This is because they're in that really deep stage of sleep. And it's also when wetting the bed occurs, typically. It's perhaps the most vital stage because this is when the brain attempts to recover. This is when the brain repairs, is repairing itself. And what studies have shown is when people are sleep deprived, as soon as they go to sleep, that's where they go first. Is they go to non-REM. Yes?
I have a quick question. The sleepwalking, the night terrors, does that lead to sleep? Is that a sleep deprivation part
No.
of it? Or are they
Those-
still asleep?
Right. That just is, it's typical.
It's not an interruption.
No. I wouldn't call it an interruption. It's sort of no one really knows why it happens, but it is normal. It's developmentally typical. If your child hasn't had, maybe 2 or 3 night terrors, except when they had a fever, I'd be surprised. All kids have usually had 1 or 2 of them. Sleepwalking, a lot of kids don't do that, but some kids do, where they talk in their sleep. And again, it's not interrupting their sleep at all. No. Now, second type of sleep is rapid eye movement or active sleep. This is where you do a lot of your dreaming and where you remember. You remember the dreams oftentimes from this stage. Okay. This is essential because this is where processing and consolidation of emotions, a lot of the memories, and any stress you had, sort of, if you want to say working through it, or processing it, or interpreting it, whatever it is that goes on at that time, it happens during REM sleep. Okay? So this is an important time, no question. If your REM is disrupted one night, your body's going to do more REM sleep periods, or have more REM sleep periods to catch up with it. Okay? And I'll show you a graphic of that in just a bit. 4 different sleep stages. Okay? All you really need to know is that each sleep stage is important for a specific reason. And if you miss one sleep stage, or if it's interrupted for whatever reason, because there's a lot of noise, or because you're overly stressed and so you're repeatedly waking throughout the night, or you have sleep apnea and you keep waking because you can't breathe very well, or because you're on medication that's kind of waking you up throughout the night. Well, what happens is you may think, maybe this child slept 8 hours, but they didn't. They didn't really sleep 8 hours. And you may think, okay, my child had 10 hours of sleep, but they're still tired because something happened during one of those stages. Now, this is an example of what goes on in terms of a skill that you're learning. Let's say you're learning a foreign language. Okay? Lots of different skills go into learning a foreign language. There's the vocabulary. You have to learn the words. Vocabulary consolidation and processing happens in that first stage, in that deep stage of sleep. Learning how to enunciate, the motor skills that go along with that, happens in stage 2. It's another non-REM stage, but it's a different one. It's a different stage of sleep. Auditory memory of the sound, the way that word sounded, that happens throughout all 4 stages. And then anything that's emotionally laden, any type of memory that has emotion connected to it, that happens at REM sleep. So here you have these different stages as you're trying to learn a foreign language. If you miss out on sleep for whatever reason, even in one of those stages, your learning is less complete. Okay? So the more you learn during the day, the more sleep you need to have. That's why, have you ever had a day where you were, you're at work, or maybe you were doing a self-study, and your brain was tired. You ever said that to people? My brain is tired. Well, your brain is telling you, you've worked me really hard. I need some rest so I can consolidate all that stuff you just put me through. This is a hypnograph. This just demonstrates kind of the sleep stages for a night, a typical night's sleep. So initially, you kind of make your way down to this deep stage of sleep. And again, that's the first stage you have to go through 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, but it's rather rapid in terms of the progression. You're down here for a good, couple of hour, usually 90 minutes, maybe 120 minutes. Then you come up and you have your first dream. Doesn't last very long. You go right back down to deep stage sleep, that deep sleep, that restorative sleep. Then the rest of the night, you really don't go back down to that. Now the function is more on the dreaming, more on the learning. So it's almost like this is consolidation. This is where it becomes more of a learning experience. But obviously it's important. All of them are important. Okay? All right. How do we sleep? Why? What causes us to sleep? There's something called the circadian rhythm, and obviously here at Spring Garden we talk a lot about rhythm. Okay? There's a rhythm to our day. Well, sleep is included in that. Okay? The timing of sleep is controlled by this internal clock that sort of tells us when it's time to wake up, when it's time to go to sleep, as long as we don't have something that's kind of keeping us, that's interfering with that, as well as when it's time to eat lunch, when it's time to use the bathroom, etc., etc. There is some will, some control we have over that, obviously, but we're fighting against this circadian clock. What's interesting is that you've got this clock that if we didn't have any lights, if we didn't have, if we kind of lived 300, 400 years ago, we would rise with the sun and we would go to sleep when it's set, right? Well, we don't do that anymore because that's not the way our life is. So what our brain has always been affected by cues, like the light, the sun rising, the sun setting. These are called Zeitgebers. Great word. Another light that would wake you up would be a light in a room, a TV, an iPod, something like that. But it's waking you up or it's keeping you awake when you shouldn't be. Your brain doesn't know the difference. So if you've got a child, when it's time to go to bed and they're in their room and they're watching television, to your brain, it's time to stay awake. There's more that goes into it, but that's an example. Okay? Around 6 o'clock, the liver stops. It starts taking in sugar, starts storing glucose. You begin to feel tired. That's part of that rhythm. Okay? In typically functioning individuals. What's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it's a little bud on the hypothalamus, which is an internal brain structure. It senses light. When it senses light, it wakes you up. It stops, it tells the pineal gland, which is another small structure in the brain, don't produce melatonin. Melatonin is a natural sleep-inducing agent. Okay? Once the lights go out, the suprachiasmatic nucleus says, hey, pineal gland, start letting out that melatonin because it's time for bed. So that doesn't happen right away. It's a process that happens over a couple of hours. In adults, melatonin is secreted around 9. In children, it's probably a little earlier, but I don't know for sure. You also see, once melatonin is released, you see a reduction of body temperature as well. Okay, so this is setting up the body to sleep. Now, the timing is affected by what's called chronograph or chronotype. How many of you are morning people? As in, you wake up at the same time every morning, you like the morning. Okay, how many of you are not? How many of you are evening people? Sure. Can you be a mixture of the two? I imagine you can, but most people, you like the morning and you feel better, you wake up early, or you're an evening person. I am a morning person. My wife is not. She's got to have her coffee right away. Okay? So to a degree, you've got to kind of, you may have to, like for example, if you do shift work, third shift, so you're doing the overnight shift, or you're doing the late shift, and you're a morning person, that's hard. I imagine that's very difficult. So again, but we as humans fight that sort of natural propensity to sleep when we're supposed to sleep. Okay? I put this here just so you know that I can tell you that an adult should have 8 hours of sleep. But you know what? We're not all created that way. There are mutations on certain genes that sort of indicate that, okay, you can have 2 or 3 hours less of sleep and you do okay. For whatever reason, way back when, your ancestors needed to get less sleep, and that's what's kind of carried over time. Okay? This is an example of the circadian rhythm. It's just a graphic representation. So here's noon, and here's midnight right here. So you see, here towards the evening, around this time, what is that, 6:30, 7 o'clock? That's when your blood pressure and your body temperature are at the highest. Do you ever see kids who are kind of spinning, do your kids ever kind of spin their wheels right before they go to bed? They're a little hyper. That's because of this. Your body's, it's almost like it's going over the waterfall. It's like ready to take that plunge. Here's where melatonin secretion starts. Bowel movements are suppressed, and then you're going into, here's the deepest sleep around 2 a.m. Again, this is more for an adult. For kids, everything would be a little earlier, but it's the same idea. Lowest body temperature is around 4:30. So here's your deepest sleep. Here's when you're kind of dreaming, and then right around here is when you start to wake up. Okay? Now again, that's with kind of a naturally functioning circadian rhythm. Okay? So there's that rhythm once again. We as humans fight this rhythm all the time. Right? Not just with sleep, we fight it with eating, we fight it with all sorts of things. Now, were you raising your hand? Oh, I'm sorry.
Well,
Yes.
I was thinking fastest reaction time and best coordination in the late afternoon. Let's put our basketball games then, or something like that.
Right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And again, it would be nice if we could go back 300 years and actually find this occurring, because this is not the way life is, all right? It's like, for kids, it would be better if school started late. And we'll get into that research coming up. But that's not going to happen. Or at least it's not happening in most places. Although some places, some school districts are doing that and they're finding fantastic results. I am not saying we should do that at Spring Garden. But, it's compelling evidence. Now, that's the physiology of sleep. How about the psychology of sleep? What goes on? How do we kind of start preparing ourselves for sleep? And you're not conscious of this. I mean, you're conscious of, I'm excited to go to sleep, or I'm not excited to go to sleep, depending on what you've been through that day. If you have, if you have chronic nightmares, if you have PTSD, if you love sleeping, if you don't, whatever it may be. What we find is concentration decreases. It's harder to pay attention. It's harder to focus, to do that effortful attention, because your brain doesn't want to do that. The glucose isn't there anymore to do that. To have that effortful attention, you got to have glucose that goes up into your head or into your brain to have, to have those processes function. It's not going to happen. Motivation for activity decreases. Now, have you ever realized that the garbage can is still out by the curb, but yet you're ready to go to bed? And so you're like, I'll leave it. But if it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'd probably go get it, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Attraction to routines that ultimately lead to falling asleep. All right, I want to take that hot bath, because then I know I can put on that nice warm bathrobe and I can climb into bed. This is if you don't have kids. All right? But this becomes attractive.
You can do that with your kids.
Yes, you can. You can. And as a matter of fact, that's a really good intervention for sleep problems, is modeling appropriate sleep routine and sleep rhythm. I tell all parents I work with in my practice, and even people I don't work with in my practice, that you as a parent, you're the best model for your kid, at least until they're about 10 or 11 years old, and then you lose them for a little bit, until they're around 18 or 19 years old. But that's the time. If you want something to improve, you got to look at yourself, and sleep is a good one. I know my older son has come downstairs and like, Dad, why are you awake? It's bedtime. And I think to myself, he's right, and he's being influenced by me, because I'm still awake. So, alertness and arousal decrease. Again, you're starting to go almost into that, you're very relaxed. You're almost in that twilight sleep. And you may be having what are called hypnagogic experiences or hallucinations. These are not psychotic, they're very normal, but you kind of think that you're somewhere else and you don't realize that you're asleep. Okay? What's fascinating is that I have had kids come to me with diagnoses of psychosis or schizophrenia, and they're reporting hallucinations. But no one's asking, when do you have them? Visual hallucinations are extremely rare in anybody. Anybody who says they have visual hallucinations, it's likely it's because of something else. Okay? They're not psychotic, more than likely. In kids, and even in adults, it's, they have them just as they're falling asleep or just as they're waking up. Those aren't psychotic. But the questions aren't being asked. I keep saying that because I want you all to be really good consumers and advocates for yourselves and for your kids. Because otherwise, they're getting put on a medication. Otherwise, they're getting a label and a diagnosis that likely is not conducive to proper functioning. All right, what does sleep do in terms of your skills? Well, like I said, it helps to organize memories, solidify learning, and improve concentration. It helps with different types of memory, not just the memory of like learning spelling words, memorizing your spelling words, but also learning how to ride a bike. Those are two different types of memory. One you declare, one you can say. The other one, if you ask someone how you ride a bike, they may not be able to explain to you how they ride a bike, but they can show you how to ride a bike. Okay, that's different. In motor learning, sleep is important for that child to demonstrate that they have learned that skill. You'll see an increase in their learning of that skill, whether it's swimming front stroke, freestyle, or it's learning how to tap dance. If they sleep, they're going to demonstrate more learning as opposed to if they don't. Insight, it's that aha moment when they're like, oh, that's how you do the problem. Sometimes the greatest insight comes from when you wake up the next day. Because you've thought about it, not consciously, but you've thought about it over time. Cognitive flexibility. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but cognitive flexibility is a higher order thinking skill. It's an executive function. It allows one to think about multiple problems or multiple sets of information at once, or to go back and forth between that. Why would that be important? It's important in the classroom, certainly, to be able to go back and forth with whether it's copying things off the board, back and forth, being able to be flexible in that regard. How about in a social situation? Being able to take another person's perspective, that's cognitive flexibility, okay? Sleep improves that. If, however, you don't sleep, so this particular study here, some participants in a study went 32 hours without sleep, and there was a control group that slept. When they were tested on these two types of cognitive flexibility tests, one is where you have to come up with as many words with